This is Research Like a Pro, Episode 17, Discovering Ancestor Actions, World War II War Mothers. Welcome to Research Like a Pro, a genealogy podcast about taking your research to the next level, hosted by Nicole Dyer and Diana Elder, accredited genealogy professional. Diana and Nicole are the mother-daughter team at FamilyLocket.com and the creators of the Amazon best-selling book, Research Like a Pro, A Genealogist's Guide. I'm Nicole, co-host of the podcast. Join Diana and me as we discuss how to stay organized, make progress in our research, and solve difficult cases. Let's go. Welcome to Research Like a Pro today. We're excited to talk about a Veterans Day theme since it's Veterans Day coming up. And I'm Nicole. I'm happy to be here today. Hi, Diana. How are you?
I'm great. Thanks so much. Hello, everyone.
So I wanted to remind you guys that if you could please leave us a review and ask a question, we'll answer it here on the podcast. So our review for today is from one of our listeners, Nicole Smith, and her review is, every episode is packed with information and never fails to disappoint, but episode 9 has been my favorite so far. I plan on having my son listen to this episode purely for Diana's writing tips. They were excellent. If Diana ever decides to teach a course on expository writing, let me know.
I love that. That's so great. And I've thought about that it would be kind of fun to do a whole class on writing. So I'll have to definitely think of that for the future. Nicole also left a question for us. And she says, I do have a question about running into bright, shiny objects. While I'm researching, where could I make a note of information I come across that appears interesting, but is not part of my objective? This is a great question. And this happens to us all of the time. So one of my favorite things to do is to keep a note on Google Keep. And we talked about that with the previous episode, that Google Keep is a fun place to do virtual sticky notes. And so I actually have a few sticky notes on there with this very type of thing. One example was when I was doing some newspaper research and I came across a surname that was not part of my objective, but I really wanted to return to this newspaper and examine the surname. So I made myself a note in Google Keep and copied the URL of the newspaper so I wouldn't lose that and exactly what I wanted to find out. And another place you can do that, you can put it in your future research suggestions for your project. So let's say that you're doing a project and you're following your objective, you bring it all to a conclusion, but in the midst of your research, you discovered another ancestor, another collateral relative that you'd really like to do some research. And you just put that in your future research suggestion. And, making sure you write it down someplace will help you to not be so concerned about losing track of that information. Nicole, do you have any other ideas that you do when you run into bright, shiny objects?
What I do is I keep a list of future research suggestions and I keep it in my research project document. And sometimes, like if I come across these ideas when I'm doing my analysis, I'll just take that into account when I'm making my research plan. But if I've already done my research plan and I come across more things, I'll put it down in the future research suggestions.
Yeah, there's several places to put it. And, there's not one right or wrong way. I would say just figure out a place to put it that works for you and maybe put it a couple places if you're worried you'll forget about it.
Good ideas. All right, well, today's episode is about Veterans Day. Well, just kind of along the lines of Veterans Day because it is the 100th anniversary of Armistice Day, which was what Veterans Day was created out of. On November 11th, 1918, the armistice that ended the fighting on land, sea, and air in World War I between the Allies and Germany. So this year is the 100th anniversary of that. And as you know, the holiday Veterans Day was created from Armistice Day in 1954 to honor all military veterans from not just World War I, but World War II as well. And so today we thought we would talk about one of our ancestors, Florence Creer Kelsey. She is Diana's grandmother, and we are going to kind of talk about using the Research Like a Pro method to discover her story and the story of her 3 boys who served in World War II, and kind of some of the things that Diana found out when she did this research project. So it'll be a little bit of a case study, and since it's discovering more of our ancestors' actions, then the result would be less of a research report and more of a story. So we're going to talk about how Diana created the story of her grandmother, Florence, and her experiences with World War II. So Diana, tell us how you were inspired to start this project and what your objective kind of was.
Well, two things came together, and it was March of 2016 that I wrote this. And the first thing that happened was Laurel Thatcher Ulrich came to Utah and did a talk up at the University of Utah. They were opening up a new archive about 20th century women's legacy, and they'd invited Laurel to come and talk. And I decided that I wanted to go up and meet her and listen to her lecture, and I was so inspired. If, any of our listeners don't know who Laurel Thatcher Ulrich is, she wrote A Midwife's Tale, and it was based on the diary of Martha Ballard. And this diary had generally been dismissed by scholars. It basically just gives very mundane details in Martha Ballard's life. She was a midwife, and she would just report the weather, the time of day that she delivered the baby, and how big the baby was, and just had all these little details. But doing the research on it, Laurel Thatcher Ulrich put it into the context of the community and the history, and basically wrote this entire book about this midwife that was absolutely fascinating. And so I was really wanting to hear what she had to say about our 20th century women's lives. And so when she gave her talk, she talked about the leavings of people, what we leave behind. And as genealogists, we're really used to working with the leavings, right? We work with certificates and the censuses and the deeds. These are all things the government pretty much required to be written down, and things were left behind in that way. But then what about the things from a person's life? The little objects, the artifacts, the writings that are not required by the government that we sometimes get handed down to us. And what can we do with those? How can we use those to give meaning to someone's life? So I was really inspired by Laurel's talk. And that same month, Nicole had written a blog post about the public service of our female ancestors. And I thought it'd be really fun if I could write about an ancestor close to me who had done some public service. So I called my mom and I said, "Did Grandma Kelsey, she, involved in any public service?" Because she was a housewife. She never worked outside the home once she married and had children. And my mother said, "Well, yeah, she was a war mother." And that got me thinking about her war mother experience. And I looked through a pile of papers that I had brought home from my mother's home up in Idaho. And I knew a lot of stuff in there related to Grandma Kelsey. She was a scrapbooker, which is dear to my heart because I'm a scrapbooker. My mother was a scrapbooker. So, we have 3 generations there. And she had some pages on the war mother period of her life. I knew absolutely nothing about this. I didn't think to ask her about that when I was a little girl visiting with her. And my mother didn't know. She was just a little girl when her mother was a war mother. So I had to do some good old-fashioned research to learn about this. So basically my objective was to discover Grandma Kelsey's public service as a war mother based on her leavings. And I had news clippings, a flag, photographs, and a magazine cover. That was what I had for my research.
Great. So you had a lot of artifacts to analyze. So in the Research Like a Pro process, the next step would be to analyze what you have and then create a research plan. So kind of tell us the artifacts and the clues that you found from Grandma Florence's leavings.
Well, first of all, I noticed that she had a flag. It was a physical flag. It wasn't big, but it was a real little flag, and she had just tucked that in between the pages. So when I looked at that, I noticed that it only had 48 stars. So this was the flag that was flown during World War II before Hawaii and Alaska were made states. So that was kind of fun, knowing this was an original little flag that she felt was important to save in her scrapbook. And then she had cut out a great big magazine cover, and this was from Some magazine, and it was actually a beautiful color cover, and it was commemorating raising the flag on Iwo Jima. Well, when I thought about that, I realized that she had all 3 of her boys fought in the Pacific theater of the war and were very involved in all of the battles there. And so that is the part of the war she would have been following probably the most. So that was probably a really significant event, and she had cut that out and saved that. And then she had, of course, a big, huge news clipping that World War II ends, and that was neat. See that. She also had some photographs and some little news articles, just a couple little clippings about the war mothers. And then I found a little journal entry about the 50th anniversary about war mothers. So I had a few different scattered things, and I had a lot of questions. questions. And one of the things that we teach with the Research Like a Pro process is to get those questions down, because those are the foundation of your research plan. So my questions were, what the heck is the War Mother organization? When did that start? I wanted to know all about the history of that. And then I wanted to know about Grandma Kelsey's chapter. They called each little individual grouping of women in a geographical location a chapter. And I wanted to know more about her specific chapter. And then I wanted to know what she did. What kind of things did a War Mother do? And specifically, what was her role? So that was basically my research plan, discovering all of those different things.
Cool. So I had a question about the journal entry. Did you have Grandma's journal, or did this just get taken out of the journal and put with the other items?
I had to go searching for it. I had this pile of papers that I brought home from my mom's, and in it were several loose sheets of paper that were her journal from this era. Well, I think it was from about the 50s, 60s on. So she didn't keep a journal like her entire life, but I had these loose papers, and then I had a later journal that was actually a bound journal. So I was digging through the papers, trying to find more information, and came upon it.
All right. So after you kind of had your questions and a plan to go find more information, what did you do first? Where did you find some answers?
Well, luckily, we live in the internet age and we can find so many things on Wikipedia. So I did some digging on Wikipedia and I found out that the American War Mothers was founded in 1917, which was towards the end of World War I, when the United States had entered the war. And they weren't given it a specific charter until 1925. And it was really, really fun because Wikipedia had this link to a congressional hearing where this woman in Kansas City, her name was Margaret McClure, and she has gone to Washington, D.C., and it's a congressional hearing, and she is giving evidence about why the War Mothers need a congressional charter. And I'll just read this little statement that I found in the midst of the entire hearing. And she says, "We thought this an especially fitting time to ask this because your Congress 10 days ago on the 8th day of May passed a bill creating Mother's Day, which has spread a most wonderful sentiment throughout the world, and that day has been observed by everybody. It brings a little closer the thought of Mother and her service to the world, and in the light of the phrase of that bill which pays homage to the American mother so beautifully, we thought your body could give additional emphasis to that by your recognition of the mothers of the World War." So I thought that was very smart of them that they would tie the American War Mothers to what the Congress had just done in creating Mother's Day as a holiday. So they did. They gave official recognition to it. They got a congressional charter. It's nonprofit, non-political, nonpartisan, non-sectarian organization, and its all members are mothers of children who have served or are serving in the armed services during a time of conflict. So I learned a lot about the American War Mothers, and then I'd also heard a lot from different sources throughout my study of World War I or II about this whole thing about putting the stars in the windows, and you would be able to see if someone had died in that family in the war because of the stars. And so I also needed to learn a little bit about that because I kept running across this terminology of blue stars and gold stars. So what happened was the first service banner was designed by a captain in 1917 because he had two sons serving in the war. And families all over the country began to adopt the practice. And they would sew blue stars for each child serving in the military and put on this banner and put it up in their windows. And then if a son or daughter died in active service, the gold star replaced the blue. So that can help me understand the history of the organization.
That's a good thing to know. It's all good background information to help you understand all of the news clippings from Grandma Florence.
Right. And especially sometimes she would just have little references to things, and I didn't understand what those were. And so that's why I had to get kind of a solid background and base for my research here.
So next, did you have to go deeper into discovering about the War Mothers, or was that enough information and you were ready to go forward and analyze the pieces of news that you had from Florence?
Yeah, that was enough for me. That actually took quite a while. It was not easy to find information on the War Mothers. Digging in.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes you get lucky and you find information right away when you're doing your internet searching. And this, I had to do quite a bit of digging to figure it out. By the time I had waded through quite a few things, I felt like I had a good solid base. Then I needed to figure out Grandma's influence, or how it influenced her and her involvement in it. So I had to really dig into those sources that I'd already found. I only had those 5 or 6 things that I mentioned previously. I didn't have anything else to go by, and so I needed to extract every single detail out of them that I could. So I first started with the news clippings, and I discovered that my grandmother, Florence Kelsey, was actually the president and first vice president of the Casual War Mothers chapter. So that was kind of cool to find out how she served, that she was basically in charge.
So the Casual War Mothers chapter, do you think that was for all of Casual County?
I think so. Yeah, she was from Declo, and I think that took in all the little communities all over Casual County, and they met in Burley, Idaho, which is the larger city there in Casual County. And from what I could tell, this was just a gathering of all the women in the area that had sons serving in World War II. So another news clipping talked about how their chapter had traveled from Burley to Boise by train to visit the Veterans Hospital, and that they had stayed overnight in Boise so they could also visit the Soldiers' Home, where they had taken boxes of clothing for the veterans, along with some magazines, which were welcome gifts to the soldiers. Yeah, so now I have a question about what is the Soldiers' Home? What's the Veterans Hospital? And had to understand more about those places, which were apparently in Boise. I also learned from the news clippings that they had an annual Christmas dinner where they voted to give the Sherman Rose family a cash gift of $25, which was cool. And they also gave a cash gift to the children's home, and that they were getting ready to make their regular Christmas contribution to the Veterans Hospital in Boise and the Soldiers' Home. So I kept getting these notices about the Soldiers' Home and Veterans Hospital.
So what did you find out about them? What was the Soldiers' Home?
Well, luckily there was, again, a little bit on the internet, and I learned that these soldiers' homes had been created all over the United States, and they were for soldiers who were disabled, elderly, unable to live on their own. Some of them were run by the federal government, but often they were run by the state or even like a larger city. And I learned that there's a whole list of them on the FamilySearch Wiki, and it has a list by state of all the different homes and how to access their records. So for me, this was the first time I had learned about this record set, which was actually really helpful for genealogy research as a whole, to learn that there was another place to maybe go to get records. So that was kind of a fun side shoot of this project. But specifically, I learned that there was a soldiers' home in Boise, and it was built in 1893 for veterans of state militias who had fought in the Civil War. Isn't that interesting? Idaho wasn't really part of the Civil War. You know, you wouldn't think of that because it was basically a territory. There was not much out there, but apparently they had a place. If somebody had fought in the Civil War and they moved to Idaho, they could apply to live in the soldiers' home. And it continued to house veterans with the very most that it had in 1951. They had 132, and then they built a brand new home in 1966 and completely destroyed all the old buildings that had been there since 1893. And now it's a park, 38 acres of Veterans Park. So I couldn't go visit it today, and there are no modern day pictures of it, but I found a postcard that had a photo of it on a blog, the Idaho Meanderings blog. So that was really fun to see what it would have looked like when my grandmother went to visit it.
Yeah, that is really neat.
And then I had a couple of pictures, and one of the pictures had all the women dressed up in their dresses, and they had poppy corsages and little ribbons on and little kind of funny hats. And I was trying to figure out what this photo was all about. You know, I found a lot of clues and a lot of questions from looking at just the 5 or 6 things that were in the scrapbook. So what did I need to do next? So I had done some research, I'd analyzed everything, and the purpose of this objective was to actually write a blog post. So I didn't do a research report. I didn't keep a formal research log because this was back before I had finalized the Research Like a Pro process. I was just following my natural intuition about how to do research. So it culminated with writing a blog post, and I did use citations to put in some endnotes for all my sources, but it was really, really fun to put all together writing it. I could have done the research, learned about it, and then just left it at that. But it was really in the writing that I made the sense of it. And going back and rereading it helps me remember all of the fun things that I learned about.
That's great that you were able to write it up, because sometimes we do the research and then we don't actually get to the writing part. So maybe our listeners out there could consider starting a blog, because sometimes it gives you that motivation to write an article about your research and to actually share it in some way. And writing is such a great way to share your research because it makes you put it all into words and make the connections that you made when you were researching and not forget it.
Right. And my grandmother had written her own history, and I could have just left it at that. But guess what? In her own history, she doesn't say a word about being a war mother. That's just something that she didn't think to put in her histories. And I think so often when we read histories of our ancestors, we don't realize that we could dig deeper into their lives and find more things about them to give meaning to their lives. So I would really recommend everyone listening to think about your 20th century ancestors. We don't have to always focus on our ancestors from the 1800s or the 1700s. We can talk about the ones that are a little bit closer to home, and we can discover more about them and write more about them, because our children and our grandchildren, these ancestors of ours, are going to be further removed from our descendants, and they'll want to know about them. I'm really grateful my grandmother kept her scrapbook and kept those little clippings, and it makes me think that we also, as family historians, need to make sure that we are leaving a record behind of our lives. When's the last time that you clipped something out and put that somewhere? We rely so much on digital things, and I sometimes worry that we're not going to have anything physical to pass down to our family members.
Yeah, there's kind of something special about holding a physical object that belonged to one of your ancestors, isn't there?
There is. And I think the things that we choose to save shows the importance we place on them. I certainly would not have thought to place any importance on Grandma's war mother years if she had not saved all those artifacts and all those things from her service as a war mother. And it just really made me think of how those mothers and mothers today that have sons or daughters serving in the military, how there's this camaraderie that they must have enjoyed or do enjoy as they meet together. I don't know if people still get together to do that, but when I asked my mom about the war mothers, she said she did remember going as a young teenager to the weekly meetings, and they would get together and sew, and then they would make things and take them to the veterans' homes. That was their thing to keep themselves busy while they were worried about their boys possibly losing their lives. So I thought that was a really neat lesson, that even in the midst of a challenging time, doing service for other people can kind of help you to deal with the challenges of the time.
Yeah, that's a great lesson. And it's a good thing that I can teach my kids. I'm sure my daughter would love learning about her grandma Florence and her service that she gave to those who were fighting and who were veterans and who needed her help. And she was an amazing seamstress. In fact, we have that quilt that she made for you, and we like looking at that and talking about our great-great-grandma made this. And it would be a perfect little lesson or discussion to have with my kids about, she didn't just sew blankets, she sewed clothing and other kinds of things to help soldiers while her sons were gone. And then maybe do an activity about doing service for people who are in need. And obviously, those of you who read the blog know that it's one of my favorite subjects to talk about, how to teach our children about the stories of our ancestors.
I really love that, because Veterans Day is often our children don't understand the significance of that, and it just becomes another day in Seattle. When we were living there, the school always was recessed for Veterans Day. And it was fun because my oldest son's birthday is on November 11th, and he always had the day off from school. And then we moved to Utah, and they don't take the day off, and he had to go to school on his birthday for the first time in his entire life. It was so funny. I wonder how much our children really understand about the significance of that holiday. So doing some kind of a project or thinking about our ancestors and connecting them with that would be a great way to celebrate all the veterans in our family history, and to think about the mothers that sent their boys off to war throughout our family's history.
Yes, thank you. That's a great way to end the episode. And we'll put a link to the article that Diana wrote after this research project in the show notes so that you can read about it. It's called The Scraps of a Well-Behaved Woman's Life, Florence Creer Kelsey, Part 1. So you can see some pictures of the ephemera and the artifacts that were used in the project and some of the conclusions that Diana came to. So that'll be a good reading for you after this. Well, thanks for listening today, and we hope you have a good Veterans Day and are able to honor the veterans in our country and the people in your life that served in the military.
All right. Have a great week, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to Research Like a Pro with Diana Elder, accredited genealogy professional, and Nicole Dyer. We hope that something you heard today will help you make progress in your own genealogy research. If you like what you heard, please leave us a review on iTunes or Stitcher, or visit our website, familylocket.com, to contact us. You can find our book, Research Like a Pro, A Genealogist Guide, on Amazon.com and other booksellers. We hope you'll start now to research like a pro.